Yeah, I agree to that. And I think it's also not just the mainstream media that's losing here. It's also the left and the neocons who want to see a forever war. But one of the things that Donald Trump successfully campaigned on was ending the war in Ukraine. And, I know Ukraine obviously doesn't want to cede territory, but the outcome that we are hearing talks of, which would be Russia gets some control of territory, Ukraine gets some kind of NATO-like security agreement, is the outcome that was the only possible outcome. Russia will not stop until they reclaim territory that is in their interest. You have people living in Ukraine who believe that, or they describe themselves as ethnically Russian. Of course, they were in the Soviet Union together. So there are geopolitical forces at play that the people in Washington, D.C. don't understand. And Donald Trump is the only leader right now who understands. And unfortunately, there's going to have to be compromises, and they're going to be tough.
Well, look, almost 1 million people have been killed or wounded in this war. I know it's something that really needs to come to an end. I know that's the president's, the main thing he wants to get done. This afternoon, I have more questions than answers. I want to see what's going to happen. Look, Zelensky is saying he needs a guarantee of peace that is not short-lived. We expect Trump to do what he does best, which is negotiate, get in between these groups and talk with them and find out what the possibilities are. Look, ultimately, I think both sides are going to have to give. We're going to see both of them bobbing and weaving on their own. But I have to say, this is hopeful now, I think, for the first time in a long, long time.
And I would say that we should never lose sight of the fact that Ukraine was victim of a crime committed by Putin and Russia. Never lose. There was no excuse for invading that country that I know of. I mean, NATO does not have a function as an offensive military force. It's there merely for defense. And what bothers me is, why is Putin so nervous about having NATO on the border? Does he actually believe that NATO is going to invade Russia? That's never going to happen. That's highly unlikely. No, he doesn't want NATO there because maybe he'll never be satisfied until Russia has absolute control over Ukraine. Let's hope we get a peace treaty. That would be a great idea. But let's not put Ukraine in a position where it's going to be defenseless from a future Russian invasion.
Well, it's pretty fascinating, actually, that you had the Trump administration out over the weekend talking about, NATO-like Article 5 defense commitments to Ukraine. That's not something that's been part of that conversation recently. So now, what does that mean? I don't know. And what does it mean for the U.S. compared to the EU providing that defense? I don't know. But, everybody says, well, it's time for Trump to get tough with Putin. Okay. How has he not been tough with Putin? I think the fact that you've got Witkoff out there talking about that very thing is a sign that all options are on the table for Trump. He's just not squandering this chance to get Zelensky and Putin together, which nobody else has been able to do. And very few people, it seems to me, have even been willing to try to make that happen. And he's been willing to put his presidency in some ways on the line to make that happen.
And I want to see that once the treaty is completed, that Ukraine's military is so strong that Russia would have to be out of its mind to try to invade Ukraine again.
Yeah, but John, and again, I think Ukraine has every right to political sovereignty. I am not disagreeing with that. But at the expense of who? If it's at the expense of the United States taxpayer who made clear in November they don't want to fund this endless war, that's a problem.
Well, right now we have a situation where the Europeans are willing to purchase military equipment from the United States and send it to the Ukraine. We shouldn't have any problem with that.
That's totally fine
actually
by me.
maybe good for the budget.
Yeah, absolutely. But taxpayers alone should not shuffle or
But
bear
people
that
should
burden.
get rid of this nonsense that in some way Ukraine was responsible, the West was responsible for Putin invading.
I don't really see it.
Who's saying that? Nobody's saying that.
no
one here.
podcasters.
We're talking about the people sitting here. No one is saying that. And if I hear one more person, John, and that includes you, making the argument that this is somehow good for economic growth because we manufacture the weapons that are being used in this horrific war, the most horrific land war in Europe since World War II, that's economic stimulus for the United States. Well, by that logic, we should just go blow up a Midwestern city and rebuild it because that's economic stimulus. The point being is that we will ultimately have to get behind some sort of security guarantees that are not Article 5 because Ukraine's not part of NATO. But that's what will. I heard someone describe this as, I can't remember who it was, that make Ukraine a steel porcupine. That they will not be touchable.
Yeah.
Based on the security guarantees. However, what is not being spoken about, which Vladimir Putin well knows, and the people of Russia well know, is that Russia's economy is collapsing. Mm-hmm. It is contracting. Inflation and interest rates are double digits. That the second largest bank just recently, that the core lending business cratered in on itself. The banks are teetering on the brink of complete and utter collapse because they're sitting on bad low-interest loans that they were forced to make to fund the war in Ukraine. So if we take one step, united with our European allies, to say cut off all purchases of all refined product that come out of anything from Russian oil, this will get a great deal worse because oil revenue is already falling for Russia. That's why it has its largest budget deficit in spending and then revenue falling, biggest budget deficit in 30 years.
And again, I think that's on the table. And Trump was initially talking about those kinds of secondary sanctions earlier. He said, I'm going to put them on hold 2 to 3 weeks. And again, the left, or whoever, the left, all of his critics cry, well, he's weakening on Putin. No, he's talking about a 2 or 3 week window to get something done. There is a reflexive animosity to anything, any move Trump makes on this front. And I think there's also a desire to paint him as anti-Ukraine in all of this. And he's just not. He has said it before. I will say it. He's pro-peace more than anything. He wants the fighting to end. And I think he's making a very good faith effort to do that.
And you have to be careful not to trust Putin too much, okay?
No
He's
one's
a scoundrel,
trusting Putin,
okay?
though, but you have to worry. Donald Trump is doing what no other leader, Obama, Biden, they couldn't do this. They were not willing to actually have a sit-down with Putin and discuss over Crimea. Donald Trump is changing that narrative, and again, that's why he was elected.
He inherited that problem from Obama, okay, with Crimea. But he didn't really try to go, sit down with Putin and let's go ahead and make some decision with the Ukraine government that perhaps Crimea goes to Russia. All right. That didn't happen.
With Obama,
he had the opportunity the first term. But maybe it's high time that that's done. But it came as a high cost. And I'm sorry. I'm just against the use of violence against the military.
Which is why this war has to end.
Especially amongst civilized countries.